October 19th, 1944. Camp Scottsbluff, Nebraska. The air tastes of dust and distance. Annalise felt it coat her tongue, a fine grit that was nothing like the damp, metallic tang of the air in Normandy. Here, the sky was a vacant, endless blue. The horizon ran sharp and flat, a line drawn by a ruler. Nothing interrupted it. No shattered church spires, no skeletal remains of forests. Just fence posts and wire, stretching until they became a shimmer. A truck rumbled past the wire, leaving a plume of pale dust that settled slowly on the barracks roof, on the shoulders of her fatigues, on the back of her hand. She watched a single dust particle land near her knuckle. Precise, unhurried. The entire world here felt like that, orderly and inevitable. The American sergeant, a man whose name she never bothered to learn, stood by a crate. He moved with an economy she found unsettling, a languid confidence that didn't square with his uniform. He wasn't a soldier the way her brothers had been. He was a manager of things. Today, the things were from the camp canteen. He called out numbers, and women shuffled forward. Annalise waited for her own number, 7B, 482. Her fingers traced the faint scar on her wrist, a reminder of a field hospital and a frantic effort to save a boy whose face she could no longer picture. The American called her number. His pronunciation of the German numerals was flat, all wrong. She stepped forward. He consulted a list on a clipboard, then reached into the crate and handed her a small box of soap, a packet of writing paper, and something else. A cylinder wrapped in thin, dark paper, sealed with a colorful band. It was heavy for its size, solid. She held it in her palm, her mind a blank. The object made no sense. It was a cigar, a dark, fragrant, perfectly rolled Cuban cigar. The scent rising from it was rich, complex, a blend of sweet earth and spice that was so alien in this dry, dusty place it felt like a hallucination. She looked from a cigar to the sergeant's impassive face. He just nodded, already looking for the next number on his list. Annalise walked back to her spot by the barracks wall, the cigar cupped in her hand as if it were a wounded bird. Greta was watching her, eyes narrowed. Annalise sat, the wooden bench hard beneath her. She held the object up. It was real. The paper band was printed with intricate gold lettering, a tiny, impossible piece of art. She ran her thumb over its smooth surface. Back in Munich, her father had been a party official of some importance. Once, for his birthday, a colleague had gifted him a single dry, brittle cigar made of German tobacco. He had spoken of it for weeks. This thing in her hand was something else entirely. This was a treasure, a thing for generals on the eve of victory. Greta leaned closer, her voice a dry rasp, barely audible over the wind. "Where did you get that?" Annalise just stared at the cigar, the absurdity of it a physical weight in her chest. She turned it over and over. Then she looked at Greta, her own voice a whisper she didn't recognize. "They're just giving them away." Greta was silent for a long moment, watching the other women receive their items. Another received a cigar, then another. Greta finally spoke, her words precise, factual, drained of all emotion. "Not even our officers get this." The statement hung in the air between them. It wasn't an exclamation. It was a diagnosis. Annalise looked out past the wire at the immense, indifferent landscape. The dust, the silence. The cigar in her hand felt heavier now, its dense core of privilege a puzzle she could not begin to solve. These women were not soldiers, not in the way the world understood the term. They were Helferinnen, auxiliaries, radio operators, clerical staff, nurses. Annalise herself had been a nurse with the Red Cross, assigned to a Luftwaffe anti-aircraft unit in France. She had learned to distinguish the whistle of incoming shells, the cough of a lung filling with blood, the precise pressure needed to hold a bandage against a femoral artery. Her world had been one of desperate measures, of making do, of stretching a single roll of gauze, of reusing needles, of tearing bedsheets for bandages when the official supplies failed to arrive. Her reality was defined by scarcity. The German war effort, she'd been told, demanded efficiency and sacrifice. Nothing was wasted. Every resource was husbanded for the final, glorious victory. Greta had been a signals operator. Her job was to listen, to decode, to relay messages that moved men and machines across a continent. She understood systems, the flow of information, the logic of logistics. She saw the world as a series of inputs and outputs. And what she saw in Nebraska defied every equation she had ever learned. The journey here had been the first clue. After their capture in the chaos following the Normandy breakout, they were processed not with the brutal efficiency she expected, but with a strange, bureaucratic detachment. They were photographed, documented, given medical examinations. On the transport ship, they were held below decks, but the food was regular and plentiful. Salt beef, hard biscuits, powdered eggs. It was bland, but it was there. 3 times a day. No one went hungry. She had watched the American sailors swabbing the decks, their movements unhurried, their faces bored. They chewed gum, a constant, rhythmic grinding that seemed to her the very sound of a nation with too much of everything. The camp itself was the true anomaly. Camp Scottsbluff was one of several hundred installations across the United States built to house the nearly 400,000 German prisoners of war. But it wasn't the camp from the propaganda newsreels, the grim, muddy enclosure surrounded by snarling dogs. It was a small city of wood-frame buildings, laid out in a perfect grid. The barracks were heated. The cots had mattresses. The washrooms had running hot water. There was a library, a chapel, a workshop. It was all so clean, so orderly. Annalise felt the chronic tension in her shoulders, a posture she had maintained for 3 years, begin to ease without her permission. There were no air raid sirens. The only sound at night was the wind, a lonely, ceaseless whisper across the plains. The greatest risk here was not a bomb, but a profound and terrifying boredom. The stakes had vanished. Survival was no longer a question. The only question that remained was what to do with all the time, all the food, all the quiet. And why? Why was this happening? Why this baffling, systematic provision of comfort to an enemy? It felt less like imprisonment and more like a quarantine from reality. The cigar was not an isolated incident. It was the logical, insane endpoint of the entire experience. It was the detail that broke the frame, that turned a strange picture into an impossible one. A stark, undeniable contrast governed their new lives, a binary so fundamental it felt like a law of physics. It was the world as it had been versus the world as it was now. The two realities could not coexist in the same mind, yet every day, Annalise was forced to hold both at once. In Germany, there was ersatz. Here, there was only the genuine article. The memory of coffee in Munich was a thin, bitter brew made from roasted acorns and barley, a drink that was more about the ritual of warmth than about flavor. Here, in the camp mess hall, the coffee was black, strong, and real. The aroma alone was a shock to the system, a jolt of memory from a peacetime childhood she had almost forgotten. Annalise watched the other women, how they held their mugs with both hands, breathing in the steam. They never spoke of it, but she saw it in their eyes, a small, private surrender. The second contrast was clothing. Her nurse's uniform had been mended twice. The elbows were thin, the fabric under the arms permanently stained with sweat and antiseptic. She had owned 2 pairs of darn socks. Here, they were issued sturdy denim work clothes and thick wool socks, the same kind the American Guards wore. The clothes were stiff, new, without history. When one of the women, Ilsa, ripped her sleeve on a nail, she was simply given a new shirt. No one suggested she mend it. The act of discarding a reparable garment felt more wasteful to Annalise than burning food. It spoke of a world with no conception of later. Then there was the risk. In France, the days were a constant thrum of anxiety. A distant plane could be friendly or hostile. A rumbling on the road could be a supply truck or a tank. Sleep was a shallow, temporary state, easily broken. Here, the only risk was monotony. The greatest threat was the slow erosion of purpose. The women were assigned work, in the camp laundry, in the kitchens, or on nearby farms, helping with the sugar beet harvest. The labor was real, but it felt different. It was managed, scheduled, and paid. Each woman earned 80 cents a day in canteen scrip, a currency that could be exchanged for small luxuries. Soap, chocolate magazines, cigars. The idea of being paid to work while your country was fighting for its existence was a moral pretzel Annalise could not untwist. The most profound contrast, however, was in the substance of their bodies. For years, their diets had been a careful calculation of state-mandated rationing. Food was fuel for the war machine. Potatoes, cabbage, dark rye bread that was more sawdust than flour. Meat was a rare holiday treat. Annalise remembered the feeling of a hollow stomach as a constant, low-grade companion. Here, the sheer caloric weight of their existence was staggering. At first, many of the women were sick. Their shrunken stomachs rebelled against the richness of the food. The pork, the beef, the white bread, the butter, the milk. Within a month, Annalise saw the changes in all of them. The hollows in their cheeks filled out. Their skin, once sallow, gained color. Their hair, once brittle, grew with a healthy sheen. They were prisoners of war, and they were healthier than they had been at any point in the last 5 years. This physical transformation was an undeniable fact, a truth their bodies told them even when their minds refused to listen. The abundance wasn't just around them. It was inside them. The three of them processed the contradiction in different ways. Annalise, the nurse, saw it through the lens of the physical. She was a quiet observer, her thoughts turning inward. She watched the women in the mess line, noticing the subtle shifts in their posture, the new confidence in their movements as their bodies grew stronger. She saw how the dark circles under their eyes faded, replaced by a look of rested bewilderment. When a new group of prisoners arrived from Europe, gaunt and gray-faced, Annalise felt a pang of recognition. She saw her former self in them. She would watch them over the first few weeks, charting their involuntary recovery. She'd make a mental note. Week 1, digestive distress is common. Week 3, average weight gain appears to be 2 to 3 kilograms. Week 5, arguments over small slights in the barracks increase, a sign of returning energy and depleted adrenaline. She was tracking the physiological effects of peace. Greta, the former signals operator, was the accountant. Her mind, trained to find patterns in chaos, worked constantly to quantify their situation. She became the group's unofficial archivist of absurdity. They used 6 eggs to bake 1 small cake, she'd whispered to Annalise after her shift in the kitchen. For the guards' birthdays, she would count the number of trucks that arrived at the camp each week, estimating the tonnage of their cargo. She read the American magazines from the canteen, Life, the Saturday Evening Post, not for the stories, but for the advertisements. She would study the gleaming images of cars, refrigerators, and electric stoves, her expression a mixture of contempt and fascination. According to this, she said one afternoon, holding up a magazine, the average American housewife is concerned about the whiteness of her laundry and the shine on her floors. This is what they think about while the world burns. Yet, her analysis was always tinged with a grudging respect for the sheer scale of it all. The logistics are impressive, she admitted one night. To project this much surplus across an ocean is not a sign of decadence. It is a sign of power. Ilsa was the ideologue. A former youth leader, her entire identity was welded to the doctrines of the party. For her, the camp was not a place of physical confinement, but a battlefield of the mind. She saw every act of provision as a psychological trap. The food is a trick, she would insist in hushed, urgent meetings behind the barracks. They want to make us soft, to make us forget who we are. She tried to organize resistance. She ordered the women to sing patriotic songs, to drill in secret, to maintain the discipline of their homeland. But her efforts frayed against the quiet, relentless comfort of the camp. How do you maintain a posture of heroic sacrifice when you've just eaten a dinner of roast beef and potatoes? How do you preach the virtues of Spartan discipline to a woman who has just bought a bar of perfumed soap? Ilsa's certainty began to develop cracks. Annalise saw it in the way her jaw was always tight, the way her eyes darted around, as if searching for an enemy that was nowhere to be found. She saw Ilsa watching Greta read an American magazine. A flicker of something was a curiosity in her eyes before she stamped it out and replaced it with a scowl. Ilsa was fighting a war, but the enemy refused to show up. The mechanism was invisible, but its effects were undeniable. It was a system vast and impersonal, and the women of Camp Scottsbluff were merely caught in its gears. At the highest level, it was policy dictated by the 1929 Geneva Convention relative to the treatment of prisoners of war. The United States was a signatory. The rules were clear. Prisoners were to be supplied with rations equivalent in quantity and quality to those of the base troops of the detaining power. It was a matter of law, of international honor. But for the women experiencing it, this legal abstraction was meaningless. What they felt was the material result: food as good as their captors. Annalise overheard a guard complaining about having to eat powdered eggs for breakfast again and felt a dizzying sense of unreality. He was complaining about the same meal she, his prisoner, had just eaten. But the real engine of the phenomenon was not a high-minded adherence to treaties. It was something far more American: logistics. The U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps was the most sophisticated, well-funded, and powerful logistics organization the world had ever seen. It operated on a principle of massive, standardized scale. It was simply more efficient to procure, ship, and distribute one type of food, the high-quality, high-calorie U.S. Army Standard Ration, than it was to create and manage a second, inferior supply chain for prisoners. The river of American abundance was too wide and powerful to be easily diverted. Building a separate, lower-quality pipeline would have required more administrators, more warehouses, more trucks, more paperwork. It was cheaper and easier to let the prisoners drink from the same fire hose as everyone else. Greta began to understand this first. She would watch the supply trucks unload. Crates of canned peaches from California, sacks of potatoes from Idaho, sides of beef from the Chicago stockyards. It was all branded, all standardized. She explained it to Annalise one evening, using a metaphor of her own. "Think of it as a radio signal," she said. "The Americans broadcast on one powerful frequency. Everyone in range receives it, their soldiers, their civilians, and us. To create a weaker, separate signal just for us will be a waste of energy. The power is in the simplicity of the broadcast." The women of the camp interpreted the abundance as a deliberate message of benevolence, of wastefulness, of psychological warfare. But Greta suspected the truth was more profound. It wasn't a message at all. It was simply the noise of the machine in operation. They were not the intended audience. They were just bystanders, experiencing the incidental fallout of a system so powerful it didn't even notice them. Annalise thought of the cigar. It wasn't a gift. It wasn't a bribe. It was surplus. An item ordered in bulk, distributed according to a regulation, a line item on a ledger somewhere in Washington, D.C. The impersonal nature of it was more chilling than any deliberate cruelty could ever be. A letter arrived from Annalise's younger sister, Lena, in Hamburg. The paper was thin, almost translucent, and covered in cramped, neat handwriting. Parts of the letter had been blacked out by censors, leaving dark, rectangular voids in the middle of sentences. But what remained was enough. Lena wrote about her work at a factory, about the long hours, about the constant fatigue. She wrote about the turnip winter, the endless meals of boiled turnips, a vegetable Annalise now associated with the taste of grim endurance. Then came the sentence that Annalise would read over and over again, the words burning themselves into her memory. "The weekly meat ration was cut again," Lena wrote. "We were lucky to get 125 grams last week, mostly gristle." Annalise sat on her cot, the letter trembling in her hands. 125 grams. For a week. That evening, in the mess hall, they were served meatloaf. Thick, dense slices of it, with a rich tomato glaze. Annalise watched as the woman serving her dropped a heaping portion onto her plate. It had to be at least 200 grams. A week and a half of her sister's ration, served in a single meal. She looked around the hall. The women were eating, talking, some even laughing. The food was so plentiful that many didn't even finish what was on their plates. Scraps of meatloaf, potatoes, and bread were left behind to be scraped into a bin. Annalise felt a wave of nausea. She couldn't eat. She pictured Lena, her face thinner, her hands chapped from the cold, carefully dividing a piece of gristle for her family. The contrast was no longer between her past life and her present one. It was between her present and her family's present. It was happening right now. While she sat in a warm barracks in Nebraska, her body growing stronger on a diet of American surplus, her sister was slowly starving in a bomb-ravaged city. The guilt was a physical thing, a cold, heavy stone in her stomach. It was one thing to be a prisoner of war. It was another to be a well-fed one while your own people suffered. She folded the letter carefully and put it in her pocket. The knowledge of her sister's hunger felt like a secret betrayal. Later, she saw Ilsa devouring her portion of meatloaf with a grim determination, as if she were conquering it. But Annalise noticed that even Ilsa cleaned her plate completely, leaving not a single crumb behind. The habits of scarcity died hard, even in the heart of a true believer. The quiet privilege of their captivity had become a source of shame. The friction was constant now, an ideological chafing that produced a quiet heat in the barracks. Ilsa's attempts to maintain party discipline grew more frantic. She would corner women in the washroom, her voice a low hiss of accusation. "You are forgetting. You are letting them win. Every piece of chocolate you eat is a victory for the enemy." But her words were losing their power. The physical reality of the camp was a more compelling argument than any slogan. The women were no longer cold, no longer hungry, no longer afraid. The foundations of the Nazi ideology, the narrative of a proud, resilient people besieged by enemies and sustained by heroic sacrifice, crumbled in the face of daily, monotonous comfort. How could you believe you were a member of a master race when your captors fed you better than your own government had? A role inversion occurred that crystallized the clash. The camp was run by a contingent of the Women's Army Corps, the WACs. The commander was a Captain Davis, a woman in her late 30s with short crop hair and an air of professional calm. She rarely interacted with the prisoners directly, but her presence was a constant, unsettling fact. For Ilsa, Captain Davis was a perversion of the natural order. A woman in command, wearing a uniform with authority, making decisions that affected their lives. It was an ideological impossibility. One afternoon, a dispute broke out in the laundry between two groups of German women. The argument escalated into a shouting match, then a shoving match. Ilsa tried to intervene, invoking the party, the fatherland, the need for unity. She was ignored. The chaos grew. Then, Captain Davis appeared. She didn't shout. She walked calmly into the center of the room, her hands behind her back. She spoke in clear, simple German, her accent academic but her grammar perfect. "This will stop now," she said. Her voice was not loud, but it cut through the noise. She looked from one woman to another, her gaze level and unwavering. She then laid out the consequences. Privileges would be revoked. Work details would be changed. She was not appealing to their honor or their patriotism. She was stating the operational realities of the system she commanded. Within a minute, the room was silent. The women returned to their work. Captain Davis watched for a moment, then turned and left. Annalise had watched the entire exchange. She felt no fear of Captain Davis, only a strange and unwelcome sense of respect. The captain's authority was not derived from an ideology or a threat of violence. It came from her competence. She understood the system she was in charge of, and she knew which levers to pull to make it function. Ilsa was left standing alone, her face a mask of fury and confusion. Her authority, based on a distant and increasingly abstract set of beliefs, had evaporated. The immediate, tangible authority of the American captain had effortlessly replaced it. Annalise processed the event not as a victory for the Americans, but as a failure of her own side's worldview. The system of belief she had been taught was powerful in theory, but it had proven brittle and useless against a simple, well-managed reality. Was it possible that competence was more powerful than conviction? The question felt dangerous, a heresy that once uttered could not be taken back. The evidence accumulated, a steady drip of facts that eroded the foundations of their world. Greta was the keeper of the ledger. She had acquired a small notebook and a pencil stub, and she recorded the data points of their captivity with the precision of an accountant. Her notes were not a diary of feelings, but a catalog of material reality. An entry might read, November 5th. Daily calorie allotment estimated at 3,200. Mess served baked ham, approximate 180 g. Sweet potatoes, green beans, white bread, unlimited, butter, 1 pat, apple crumble. Confirmed with kitchen worker. This is standard Tuesday menu for all camp personnel, guard and prisoner. She documented the contents of the Red Cross parcels that arrived every few months, a treaty-mandated supplement that felt like a surreal bonus on top of their daily abundance. Parcel number 4, received December 12th. Contents: 1 tin powdered milk, Klim brand, 1 tin processed cheese, Kraft, 1 tin liver pate, 1 tin salmon, 8 ounces prunes, 1 bar sweet chocolate, Hershey's, 2-pack cigarettes, Camel, 1 bar soap, Ivory. Greta would list the items, then add a note at the bottom. Total caloric value exceeds a week's civilian ration in Berlin. Annalise's evidence was less systematic, gathered through observation. She was fascinated by the camp library. It was a small room, but it was filled with books in both German and English. She found novels by authors who had been banned and burned by the Reich. Thomas Mann, Erich Maria Remarque, Jack London. Reading them felt like an act of transgression. She read All Quiet on the Western Front and felt a chill of recognition that was completely different from the patriotic fervor she was supposed to feel. She read Mark Twain's Huckleberry Finn and was baffled by its strange, meandering freedom. These books did not preach or lecture. They simply presented a different way of seeing the world, a world of individual moral complexity that her own education had tried to erase. The most damning evidence was the wage. The 80 cents a day, paid in scrip for their labor on the beet farms. Annalise remembered the propaganda posters showing decadent, money-grubbing Americans. Yet here, the Americans were paying their captured enemies for their work. The logic was inescapable. The local farmers needed labor for the harvest. The male population was at war. The prisoners were a resource. Paying them a small wage ensured their cooperation and kept them from becoming idle and disruptive. It was not kindness. It was pragmatism. It was a business transaction. This realization was, for Annalise, more devastating than any atrocity. Her nation was fighting a holy war of blood and soil. The Americans were running a business. The facts were stark, simple, and irrefutable. They were not prisoners in a great ideological struggle. They were temporary laborers, a line item on a balance sheet, cogs in a machine of agricultural production. The weight of these contradictions settled not in the mind, but in the body. Annalise began to suffer from insomnia. She would lie on her cot in the dead of night. The only sound the breathing of the other women and the ceaseless Nebraska wind scraping against the wooden walls of the barracks. The quiet was no longer peaceful. It was a vacuum, a void where her old certainties used to be. During the day, she performed her duties, spoke when spoken to, and ate her meals. But at night, the carefully constructed walls of her composure crumbled. She would feel a tightness in her chest, a physical pressure, as if her heart was being squeezed. Her thoughts would race, replaying scenes from the hospital in France, the faces of the dying boys, and then juxtaposing them with the image of a woman in the canteen buying lipstick with the script she earned picking beets. The dissonance was a kind of madness. One night, the feeling was unbearable. She slipped out of the barracks and walked to the edge of the compound, near the wire fence. The moon was full, illuminating the plains in a stark, silver light. Everything was visible for miles. The perfect geometric order of the camp, the straight lines of the fences, the dark, silent shapes of the guard towers. She clutched the unsmoked cigar, which she now kept in the pocket of her fatigues. It had become her talisman, her focus point for the insanity of it all. She remembered the smell of burning cities, the acrid smoke that clung to everything for weeks. She remembered the metallic smell of blood. She raised the cigar to her nose and inhaled its scent. Earth, leather, a faint sweetness. It was the smell of peace, of a world that had time for such things. A hand touched her shoulder. It was Greta. She didn't speak, just stood beside Annalise, looking out at the same empty landscape. After a long silence, Annalise spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't know who we are anymore." Greta's reply was equally quiet, a statement of fact, not of judgment. "We are the evidence." The words landed with the finality of a slammed door. They were the proof of a theory they hadn't known was being tested. The cost of this new knowledge was the annihilation of the self she had been. The person who had believed in the Führer, in the fatherland, in the nobility of sacrifice. That person was a ghost, a stranger. All that was left was a well-fed body and a mind hollowed out by confusion. The pressure in her chest eased, replaced by a profound, terrifying emptiness. She stood by the wire fence, the cold cigar solid, real thing in her hand, and the revelation arrived. It was not a sudden flash of insight, but the quiet settling of 100 small pieces into a single, coherent picture. She had been looking at it all wrong. Ilsa, all of them, they had been searching for the trick, the angle, the hidden motive behind the Americans' behavior, assuming it was a response to them. They thought it was about kindness or weakness, propaganda or deception. But it wasn't about them at all. This entire system of quiet, overwhelming abundance was not a tactic. It was the weapon itself. The American war machine wasn't just an army of men and tanks. It was the farm that grew the food, the factory that canned it, the railroad that moved it, the truck that delivered it. It was the seamless, soul-crushing efficiency of it all. They weren't trying to defeat the German army by breaking its soldiers' bodies. They were defeating Germany's entire worldview by demonstrating its irrelevance. They were showing, in the most undeniable material terms, that their system of chaotic, consumerist, pragmatic democracy could outproduce, outdistribute, and outlast the German system of centralized, ideological, totalitarian control. It was a war of logistics, a war of systems, and her side had already lost. The implications of this settled on her, one by one. First, it meant that her personal sacrifice and the sacrifices of everyone she had ever known were not just tragic. They were pointless. They had been struggling, starving, and dying for a system that was fundamentally inferior, a brittle ideology that shattered on contact with a more robust reality. Second, it meant that the enemy was not the bored American guard in the tower or the calm WAC captain. The enemy was the system itself, a vast, impersonal force that operated on its own logic, a logic that had nothing to do with heroism or purity or destiny. It was the logic of the assembly line. And third, it meant that there was no honorable way to resist. To fight back was absurd. To maintain ideological purity in the face of such overwhelming material evidence was a form of self-delusion. The only possible response was to witness it, to be the evidence, as Greta had said. The war was not being won on the battlefield. It was being won in the mess hall, in the laundry, in the quiet, inexorable delivery of another crate of Cuban cigars. From that night on, Annalise began to see the camp not as a prison, but as a classroom. She was a student in a brutal, unsentimental education. The human-scale moments she witnessed every day were simply data points in a system-scale experiment. The cigar in her pocket was not just a luxury item. It was a symbol of an economic engine so powerful it could afford to toss such treasures to its enemies as incidental surplus. It was a lesson in scale. The laughter she heard in the barracks, once a sound of defiant solidarity, now began to sound different to her ears. It was less brittle, more relaxed. It was the sound of women whose chronic, low-grade fear for their own survival had been lifted. The system, by removing the constant pressure of scarcity, was changing them. It was replacing their ideology, not with a new one, but with the absence of one. It was creating a vacuum. This process was not unique to them. Annalise understood that it must be happening across the continent, in hundreds of camps just like hers, to hundreds of thousands of German men. The machine was repeatable. It was scalable. The inputs were soldiers indoctrinated with a belief in their own supremacy and a narrative of heroic sacrifice. The process was a managed, pressure-free environment of total material security. The output tended to be a person whose core beliefs had been quietly and systematically dismantled, not by argument or torture, but by the relentless, undeniable evidence of their own senses. The system did not attack your beliefs. It simply made them obsolete. It showed you a world in which they no longer applied. Annalise watched Ilsa, who still tried to rally the women, and saw her not as a committed patriot, but as a woman speaking a dead language that no one else understood anymore. The future was not going to be about grand ideologies. It was going to be about the efficient distribution of resources. It was going to be about bread and butter and tins of processed cheese. The wind still blows across the Nebraska plains. It finds the corners of the old concrete foundations where the barracks of Camp Scottsbluff once stood. The wire is gone. The watchtowers are gone. All that remains is the dust and the distance. Annalise kept the cigar. She never smoked it. It remained for the rest of her life on a shelf in her quiet post-war apartment in Munich, a dark, silent object that no one else understood. It was a reminder, a question mark, a piece of a system so vast it had swallowed her entire world. It prompts us to look at the structures that surround us, the quiet, invisible architecture of our own lives. What we are given, what we are denied, and how the simple material facts of our existence shape the deepest corners of our belief. We often think of power in terms of force, but perhaps its most enduring form is the one that never has to raise its voice. If this story unsettles your assumptions, it is doing its work. The next story is about a system that worked in the opposite way, a machine designed not to provide, but to erase. Subscribe to see how a simple list of names became a weapon of resistance.